Hi, second grade. It's Miss Cashin, and I'm really excited because I get to teach you reading and to read important things of you for the next 6 days, all the way to the beginning of summer break. So I'm really excited to be here with you. So thank you to Mr. Scott for letting me trade with him and do reading for a little bit. So the reason why I wanted to do some specific nonfiction texts for the next 6 days is because I think it's really important to learn about other big social movements where a lot of people were working together to create change when things weren't fair in the past. So we can think a little more critically about how people are working together right now to create change. So I'm sure that you've talked with your class or your parents or your family, or maybe you've seen in the news that a really big movement is happening right now. Black Lives Matter. And people are working together to make it less unfair, to try and make life in America less unfair for people who are Black. And they're working to address police brutality, treating people unfairly because of the color of their skin, um, unfair practices in the workplace. So people are working to combat that it's harder to get a really good job if you're not white, and all sorts of different things. But I think it's really important to look back on history and think about other times that people have worked together effectively, just like they are right now, and created really long lasting change in America. So, I think before we start, we're going to be talking about a lot of parts of the civil rights movement, which happened super recently in the 1950s and 60s. So, when my grandparents and when your grandparents were still alive. So, this is like not a long time ago. Um, so, we're going to be talking about the civil rights movement, which is when people worked together to make it so it was less unfair in the United States to live if you were Black. But I think it's important to remember that Black history did not begin when slavery started in the United States. And it also didn't begin when desegregation or segregation began, but it is way, way, way bigger and way longer than that. But with that being said, this is what we're focusing on today. I also think it's really important to remember that as we're learning about unfair things that have happened throughout history for people who are not white, and especially people who are Black, it's also really important to remember that Black lives did matter then, and Black lives still matter now. And I believe that, and your family believes that, and your teachers definitely believe that. And that even when things were unfair in the world, it's important to remember that you are still important and you still matter, and that we are going to work together to make things better. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit. Today, we're going to read about a court case called Brown versus V means versus Board of Education. So, this is a nonfiction text. So, I'm going to go ahead and write nonfiction right here and just give you a quick reminder. When we read nonfiction text, we are going to be thinking about the author's main topic or idea and the point of view. That's what the author thinks or feels about the topic. All right. I'm going to see if I can move this guy. All right, cool. So we're going to read this one paragraph at a time. Then we'll summarize it and think of the biggest ideas, and we'll do that for all three paragraphs. And then we'll talk about the point of view for the entire article. So make sure that you have your pencil and your paper, and you're ready to take notes and follow along, because this is going to make it a heck of a lot easier to do the multiple choice and short answer questions. All right, paragraph one: background. In the 1950s, many southern states in the US were segregated or separate. Discrimination tried to keep Black and white Americans apart from one another. It seemed that everything, even schools, were segregated by race. Black children went to one school, and white children went to another. School segregation was an issue that the Black community would fight to end. A Supreme Court case called Plessy versus Ferguson took place in 1896. It allowed states to segregate schools by race. The Supreme Court did not realize that separating children by race was unfair and unequal no matter what. Racist leaders took advantage of the court's decision. They created white schools that were much better than the neighboring Black schools. This prevented Black children from receiving the education they deserved. Segregated schools held down the entire Black community. Then you can see right here, there's a restaurant with different in North Carolina with different doors for black and white customers. And right here is students making airplanes at a segregated high school in 1942. Okay, so this is a pretty intense paragraph. I'm going to go back and see what parts I thought were the most important because whenever I read a paragraph with that much information, I really have to ask myself, what was the main idea? So let's see. I think it's important to remember that a lot of southern states in the US were segregated and that black children went to one school and white children went to another. That's called school segregation. And what else is important? um, that the white schools were much better than the neighboring black schools, and this prevented black children from getting the education they deserved and held down the entire black community. That means that the entire black community wasn't really able to achieve as much as they should have been able to because their children were not getting taught in great schools. So let's pause a second. You can put me on pause and think about what was the main idea of this whole paragraph. We highlighted a couple of the important parts, but what was the main idea? Pause it and then come back. Pause it, write it down, and then come back. Okay. Hopefully, you paused it right there and you wrote down your main idea of this paragraph. I wrote down that schools were unfairly separated by race. I think I could write segregated because that would be a correct vocabulary term. And schools for Black children were much worse. That's the main idea of this entire first paragraph because it tells us what people were going to fight to change. All right, let's go on to our second paragraph. This is called The Case. A group of 13 parents in Kansas was tired of school segregation. Their children walked right past the white school in the morning. Then they waited for a bus that would take them to the school for Black children. Their school was not as good as the white school. The group of parents decided to take the Board of Education to court. The first step was to bring the case to the state court in Kansas. The case was called Brown versus Board of Education. Brown was the last name of one of the parents in the group. The court voted in favor of the Board of Education keeping the schools separate. So the first time they tried, the court said, nope, schools should be separated by race. White children should have better schools. Brown and the parents were not going to give in. They appealed, that means they tried again, and had their case heard in the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court is the most important court in the United States. It's right at the top. It's the biggest, most important one. In 1954, the Supreme Court finally determined that segregated schools were unfair and unjust. The court voted 9-0. That means everyone agreed to end segregated schools in the United States. Let's go through this and see what the most important pieces of information are. I see that it's important that the group of parents decided to take the Board of Education to court. And I see that it's important that their school wasn't as good as the white school. Can you imagine walking by a really good school and then having to get on a whole bus, go to another worse school? Ridiculous. Also think it's really important that the first time the court voted in their state, that the court said, nope, we think kids should stay separate. So I'm going to highlight that information too, because that is really critical, because that's the reason why I went to the Supreme Court. And then in 1954, the Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, voted that segregated schools were unfair and unjust. And right here we have a little picture of Chief Justice Warren, who was a big part in the decision to desegregate schools. That means to mix together Black and white children. Okay, pause me and then write down what you think the main idea was of this paragraph. Okay, hopefully you paused me right there. Here's my summary of this paragraph. I said a group of parents said it wasn't fair for their kids to get a worse education, took the case to the Supreme Court, and won. Let's move on to the final paragraph. Paragraph 3 is called the outcome. Many areas accepted the ruling and joined their schools together. Other areas did not. The governor of Arkansas even called in soldiers from the state to stop Black students from going to a white high school. The president of the US had to send soldiers to the area to make sure the students could attend school safely. Schools remain desegregated today, but racial issues are still prevalent. That means there are still a lot of them that you can see in society and at schools. We need to continue the fight to ensure that all students get equal opportunities, regardless of their skin color. All right, let's see what the most important part is here. I think it's really important to know that some places in the United States said, okay, makes sense, and joined together schools for white children and schools for black children, but other places said no, thank you. And then the president had to get involved and send in the military to make sure that kids could get to school safely, which is really scary to think about. So I'm going to highlight that part. Another thing I think is important is that although schools are desegregated today, there are other racial issues that are still really clear, prevalent, or obvious in society and at schools. And I think a lot of those issues are the ones that we're seeing people fight today about, um, fight to change today about with the Black Lives Matter movement, like police treating Black people much worse, and like I mentioned before, how schools that have predominantly Black children are often not as good still as schools that mostly have white children. So let's take a second to go ahead and summarize this last paragraph. Okay. So my summary of this paragraph is although schools aren't segregated now, kids still have different opportunities because of their skin color, and things are unfair. Because I think it's important to note, even though schools are technically desegregated, there are still a lot of things that are really unfair in the system in the United States. Okay, let's pause right here and go over our whole piece right here. We learned in the first paragraph that schools were unfairly segregated by race, schools for Black children were much worse. We learned in the second paragraph that a group of parents said that it wasn't fair for their kids to get a worse education, took the case to the Supreme Court and won. So schools were desegregated. And the last paragraph told us that although schools aren't segregated now, kids still have different opportunities because of the color of their skin. All right, we learned a lot there. I want to pause here. What do you think the author's point of view was on Brown versus the Board of Education, which was the case that we talked about, where people were working to desegregate schools? What do you think the author's point of view was in this whole passage? Go ahead and write it down and pause me. All right. I think that the author's point of view was even though the Brown versus the Board of Education that case, the parents winning that case was an important step towards justice for Black people, it did not solve the problem of racial injustice. Racial injustice is when things are not fair because of the color of your skin. So it's when things are harder if you are Black or a person of color than if you are white. Okay, team. Thanks for sticking with me. Today, your multiple choice questions are going to look like this. Make sure that you go back and check in the text. You have 6 multiple choice questions and then 2 short answers. All of them have answers in the text. Good luck. Have a great day.